Good evening, everyone. Welcome to tonight's event. This is the 31st Annual Willowbrook Memorial Lecture, The Activism of Elizabeth Lee and Lillian Hall, New Insight on the Closing of Willowbrook State School. My name is Nora Santiago. I'm the Sustainability Program Manager for the College of Staten Island, and I'm also co-chair with Professor Lavender of the Willowbrook Legacy Project. It is my honor to host this event, and I'm so pleased with the turnout of over 120 of you registered for this event. As the title states, this event will focus on the new insight on the closing of Willowbrook State School. We will start with a presentation by Jennifer Lee. She's a daughter of Elizabeth Lee, the social worker who helped close Willowbrook. We're going to have, after the presentation, Q&A, where you will have a chance to ask questions. The panelists will be Jennifer Lee, Elizabeth Lee, and Dr. Michael Wilkins. Before we continue with our program, there's some housekeeping rules I would like to go over. Everyone will be muted during the event. After the presentation, we will have a panel discussion where we will answer some of your questions. We will try to answer as many as we can. So I ask you that during the event, please put your questions into the Q&A tab throughout the presentations, and at the end for the panel session, Professor Lavender will include them in the panel discussion. There's also closed captioning available. All you have to do is click the CC button on your screen. It is my honor to introduce Catherine Lavender, co-chair of the Willowbrook Legacy Project. She's also director of the Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies program. She's a director of the Bertha Harris Women's Center and an associate professor of history at the College of Staten Island. Please welcome Professor Catherine Lavender.
Thank you so much, Nora. Oh, I forgot to put up the microphone. I'm a bad host. Okay. I'm so happy to have you here for the more than 30th Willowbrook annual lecture. We're not sure of the exact count, but more than 30 years ago, the Willowbrook Memorial Lecture was created by Professor David Good of our then Sociology, Anthropology, and Social Work program, and later our Social Work program. We're so glad that he's here with us tonight to be part of this event. And I just want to welcome you all and thank David for all of those years of leadership that he's shown on the Willowbrook project. So tonight, we're very lucky to have an opportunity to hear for the first time in public a conversation among some of the participants of the fight to close Willowbrook, or the fight to bring attention to the difficult conditions that the residents at Willowbrook faced. And we're also going to be given a much more broad understanding of that fight by Jennifer Hall Lee, who is both the granddaughter of an early advocate for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities and the daughter of a social worker, Elizabeth Lee, who's here with us tonight. So let me introduce each of our panelists. Jennifer Hall Lee is an independent filmmaker and writer, and she's currently serving on the Board of Trustees of the Pasadena Unified School District. She's a committed supporter of inclusive practices in public education and for the full funding of IDEA. She's the daughter of Elizabeth Lee, who's been working for many years to tell the story of Willowbrook, especially during this past year. Jennifer is joined tonight by two very important figures in the fight for justice at Willowbrook State School. Elizabeth Lee was a psychiatric social work assistant at Willowbrook, working in Building 6 and also in the baby unit. She later earned her MSW in social work and can bring some perspective about the role of a social worker in being an important advocate. Also, Dr. Michael Wilkins, who worked at Willowbrook as a young doctor. Both Elizabeth and Mike played a central role in revealing to the world the conditions at Willowbrook. And you're going to learn more about that from Jennifer. And afterwards, we'll all be talking together on a panel. And the panelists are looking forward to answering your questions. So please put them in the Q&A, and we'll bring them forward when we get to that part of the program tonight. So I'm very happy to turn it over to Jennifer Hall Lee, and I will share her slides, and she'll tell me when to go forward. Thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Okay, thank you very much. You can advance to the first slide, the intro. So my name is Jennifer Hall Lee, and I am on the Pasadena Unified School Board in Pasadena, California. I started telling this story last August. This is called The Brave Activism of Elizabeth Hall Lee and Lillian Hall and Willowbrook State School. This is my personal story. Next slide. And these are my sources in case anybody wanted to see any of these and take some notes on it. I found these books to be incredibly helpful to me. I own several of them. Next slide. This is Staten Island. It's the 5th borough of New York. The black and white photo of the man there is Cornelius Hall, my great uncle, who was the borough president of Staten Island. That is my school class. And Staten Island was a borough, was redlined. So that's my class picture from PS 30 in Westerly. Next slide, please. These are my grandparents, Lillian Hall and Clifford Hall. My grandfather, Clifford, was an oil worker, a union oil worker, and he was also a poet. I remember growing up and having him write poetry at the kitchen table. My grandmother was the eldest child in her family, and she helped raise her children because her father had abandoned the family. Next slide, please. Neither of them went to college. In 1956, my uncle Brian was born. He had Down syndrome, and the doctor told my grandparents to place him in Willowbrook. And my grandfather drove through Willowbrook and I believe made the decision not to put my uncle there. And he sat down in the kitchen and talked to my mother about Brian's birth and said that Down syndrome had something to do with the pituitary gland. And when I say that, people laugh, but that is what people thought at the time. And the nomenclature of the time is that the word was mentally retarded. And I just like to say that before going forward, because there's a lot of people that don't realize that. Brian was raised at home. He did not go to Willowbrook. Next slide, please. This is Brian as an adult with my mom's cousin Rita. And there's one thing about my family, the Cudahy family, is that we love sheet cakes and conga lines. There's never a wedding without one of them. And you have to remember that up to the end of this presentation. Next slide, please. These are my parents. This is my mom, Elizabeth, who is a social worker, and she worked for the Bureau of Child Welfare in New York, and my father, Leonard, who was a New York City police officer. And one day in my house, and I was about 6 years old, I found a notebook with my mom's handwriting, and I started flipping through it. And I found a little piece of a story about a girl. And I thought, oh, this must be about me. And I started to read it. And it was a story about how the parents of this girl didn't want her. And I didn't know who the girl was. I thought, is this me or is this someone else? I couldn't figure it out. And I went up to my mom and I said, who is this little girl? And she said, oh, this is a book you shouldn't be reading. And she talked to me about privacy and then told me that somebody in the girl's family was going to be taking care of her. And it made me feel a little bit better, but I never opened the book again. And interestingly, I never found it again. Next slide. This is my grandmother, Brian, and me in my grandmother's backyard. My grandmother lived not very far from Willowbrook. In fact, you could walk there. Daffodils are a huge part of Staten Island, and I have to put them wherever I can to remind me of home. Next slide. This is a card that Brian wrote to my grandmother, to Ma from Brian. Brian attended Staten Island Aid. My grandmother was very active in the PTA. And when she was a churchgoer, and she was very religious, and she told my mother once, when my mother was young, of course, and said that at the church during Sunday school, that children with Down syndrome were placed in the basement. And I believe that might have been one of the first instances, probably not the first, that she started to move into her new role. Next slide, please. This is Willowbrook. Willowbrook was built in 1948. And one of the things that I've always been very interested in is fascist architecture. that the architecture that was built in the 30s and through the 40s really lacked ornamentation. The lines were symmetrical. And as you look back now, you can really see that they were not built for human habitation. They were built to warehouse people. Next slide, please. In 1970, my parents were separated, and my mom and I moved into an apartment. And my mom got a job at Willowbrook just because it was closer to home. And today, as I was looking at this slide, I realized that I had placed it next to the Willowbrook State School postcard, and that both of these are made out of brick, which is just was interesting to me. Next slide, please. I asked her recently what it was like when she walked into Willowbrook on her first day of work, and she said, I knew I had walked into a different world. She was assigned the baby unit, or the baby building as it was called then, and building 6. She was also given a physical exam that I thought was really odd. There was a young woman there with her who was also on her first day, and the woman was exuberant to be working with babies. She was just so happy to be working with babies. And at the end of that day, my mother said that she saw that young woman later at the end of the workday, and the young woman looked stricken. Next slide, please. My mom also said that she knew she couldn't just leave, that she had a sense of responsibility. Next slide, please. Ira Fisher was a young social worker working there also. And he's the one who said to my mom, because they'd been talking about the conditions and what was happening. And Ira said, let's start a parent group. This is a photo of the Haneys. And I used to go to their house and have dinner because my mom was meeting with them. And they had a son in Willowbrook. Next slide, please. This is from Dr. Bronston's book, and usually I give this talk in a big room, and this screen is much, much bigger, and people are able to read this. I called Dr. Bronston before I gave my first presentation about this story, and I asked him about it, and he said, oh, you're Elizabeth's daughter, he said, and he sat back and he said, you know, we were laid into that place. And that to me was a very significant sentence. Like you find yourself placed somewhere, and what are your choices? What are you going to do? Next slide, please. He also told me that my mother was fierce, solid, and reliable. My mother and Ira started to go to different places to shine a light on the conditions at Willowbrook and what was happening. And people would understand, they would say, the ACLU, well, we know it's really bad there, but we're doing this now. So there was kind of no space for them to step into this new world of Willowbrook for them. And so my mother and Ira just kept trying and just kept trying and just kept trying. Next slide. And they went to the Staten Island Advance, and they talked to a young reporter, Jane Kurtin, who was going to take the story. And this is interesting to me because I think and work a lot on the power of the local press and why this is so essential in our country. And the Staten Island Advance not only took it, that they published it. And Catherine, Bernard Carabello is calling me because he can't get into this session. He just left me a voicemail. Next slide, please. November 15th, 1971, the first article about Willowbrook is published by Jane Kurtin in the Staten Island Advance. This was a time of budget cuts, so the tensions are rising. This story hit the front doorsteps of Staten Islanders because this was widely read. The Staten Island Advance was the paper on Staten Island. Next slide, please. This was the second story the next day, Tuesday the 16th, 1971. And my mother told me she was actually surprised that the paper had published it. And I often think what it was like for Staten Islanders to open their front door, look down and see this story, which really blew open the doors of Willowbrook, which were perpetually locked. Willowbrook was a locked institution. You could not go in. It was a total institution. Willowbrook was also the second largest employer on Staten Island. Next slide, please. These are excerpts from Jane Kurtin's article, and you can sort of expand these a bit to talk, and she gets into detail about how people who lived there were treated, how they were moved in and out of rooms for food and not given enough food or not given enough time. So things got very detailed about what was happening. And at the same time, my mother is organizing parents. So as you're organizing parents and these articles are coming up in the paper, people who are working at Willowbrook are getting more and more upset, particularly the top administration, including Dr. Jack Hammond, who was the director. Next article, please. These are letters to the editor. Remember those? Well, here's a letter from Ira and my mother talking about Willowbrook and talking about the budget cuts and actually saying nice things about people who are working there, who are working to help. So when I look back and I think, oh, there must have been a big clash between people who wanted to do the right thing and people who are afraid of losing their jobs, as more and more people are starting to look into Willowbrook State School, as it was called. Now, the red circle is a letter from my mom's cousin, Peggy Cudahy. And it was just so amazing to see this, how connected Staten Islanders were to Willowbrook. It was one of the largest employers, and Staten Island is kind of a small place in a way. It has this old-fashioned feel. So everyone knew Willowbrook was there, but not everyone could go inside. Next slide, please. Here are some images from Jane Kurtin's work. You can expand to take a look. These are photographs by Eric Ertz. And you can go to the next slide, please. So the coverage is continuing. The tensions are rising. My mother talked to me about a story that she saw the children or the people who lived there running to see Dr. Mike Wilkins when he would show up at work, as if it was sort of like, you know, the father that comes home from the end of the day. And she said that she remembered thinking she was really happy that they had someone who cared for them and loved them. And the memory is very clear, but that there's dim light coming in through the windows. And I remembered that dim light because I went into Building 6. My mother said to me one day when I was 9 years old, and there I am there with my Easter basket and a nice 70s white jacket. And she said, I want you to come to Willowbrook. Now, I knew this was a bad place. I knew. I heard all the stories. I heard my grandmother talking about it. I heard my mother. My mother was on the phone talking with people. And I did not want to go. And the way children do things, they kind of say, oh, yeah, I'll go there. And then you try to figure out how you're going to get out of it. I was trying to do that. But along came Saturday, I believe. And she said, come on, we're going to go to Willowbrook. And we got into her beige Volkswagen Bug and we drove over there. And I'm still trying not to go in there. And I said to her, I'll just wait right here for you. And she said, no, you're coming in. And we went in, and I remember walking up into this like lobby built room. It was huge. And the doors were huge. Now, I'm only 9 or 10, so they do seem huge, but it had that feeling of echo. And the windows were really big to the side of me, and this dim light came through, so the glass must have been very opaque. And my mother put her hand on the door handle, and she turned her head and she looked at me. And I looked at her, and her look was very serious, as if she were thinking, you're going to see something that's going to shock you. And she opened the door, and I could hear the sounds. I could hear the sounds, like people moaning, and I could smell the smell. And the only smell that was similar for me was the Staten Island Zoo. That's the memory it evoked. And she said, I want you to come in here, and I want you to stand where I tell you to stand and don't move. And so I stood in a corner and I observed. I saw all these men sitting on wooden benches, people talking, people rocking. And she crouched down to talk to someone, and she talked to him for about 15 minutes. And then we left. But I'll never forget that moment. It's like a film scene in my head. Next slide, please. It was sort of like this. I found this room, but it wasn't really. This seems much more calm than the room I was in. Next slide, please. I have a series of slides here for you to see. Dr. Mike Wilkins, when I talked to him on the phone before I did my first presentation of this, I had said, this is, he said, mass human suffering. And I've repeated this to people because people really connect with that. And it really exemplifies what was happening. Next slide, please. The loneliness of that picture on the left exemplifies what I knew of Willowbrook when I was growing up. Next slide, please. These are from Geraldo Rivera's book and Dr. Bill Bronston's book. These were images. I remember seeing things like this on television. Next slide, please. It was always the loneliness of it that really struck me as a child. Next slide, please. Dr. Jack Hammond. He didn't want my mother organizing the parents. It made him nervous. He wanted people to stop meeting with the parents. I knew he was a bureaucrat, and that's what Dr. Bill Bronston called him. And I knew he was the director. And here's a picture of him here. He was clearly not happy at all with Dr. Mike Wilkins or my mother and referred to them as troublemakers. Next slide, please. My mother and Dr. Mike Wilkins are fired on January 5th, 1972, because they spoke out and they went to the press. And the firing was shocking. And my mother knew she was going to be fired because she said to my grandparents, I have a feeling I'm going to be fired. And she was a provisional employee. They were having budget cuts. Money was tight. And all of this drama is happening at Willowbrook and on Staten Island about this. One day, a security guard handed her an envelope. And she said, oh, what's this? And he said, well, maybe it's a raise, and smiled at her. And when she opened it, it was the proverbial pink slip. She went to her supervisor, who was below Dr. Jack Hammond, and he was upset. He said, well, I didn't know about this. He said, let me get you a meeting with Dr. Jack Hammond. And she did. She went into his office, and he thought that she was an outsider. And she said to him, actually, my grandparents live here, and my brother goes to Staten Island Aid. And he was absolutely shocked that my mother was from Staten Island and my grandmother was on the PTA at Staten Island Aid and very active. Next slide, please. Dr. Jack Hammond referred to both of them as personally incompatible. And Dr. Mike Wilkins contacted an unknown reporter at the time, and his name was Geraldo Rivera. Next slide. They met at Tina's Diner, a place I used to go to a lot. And Dr. Bill Bronston also said, he said that my mother was passionate in her work. They would meet there and talk. And after Mike was fired, they had forgotten to take in his key. So he gave the key to Geraldo Rivera. Now, when a reporter gets a key to a place like that, that's pretty exciting for them. And I think that's kind of when things really started to blow up. What I can remember is that the talk in my grandmother's house and at my mom's, at our apartment, was Willowbrook. It was constantly Willowbrook. I was in 4th and 5th grade at the time. Next slide, please. My mother and Mike were referred to as radicals. Pictures like this were starting to show up on the Staten Island Advance. I remember Geraldo Rivera interviewing my mom in our apartment. And so the coverage is continuing, and the people are really starting to talk. The parents are demanding to go in, and there were 2 points. One, they stormed the offices, and at another point, I believe Dr. Jack Hammond said, okay, you want to come in, come in. And he threw open the doors, and parents went in. And one woman absolutely broke down because she saw her son there. And I believe he was eating feces, and she couldn't handle it. And that's the cruelty that was coming from the top, that was coming all the way down. And at one point, I have heard that one of the parents said to him in a meeting, said to Jack Hammond, what if we chopped off your arms and legs and threw you in a ward? So these tensions were very high, and Jack Hammond was not really somebody who could totally deal with this. Next slide, please. This is something, if you were in another room, you could read, but the firing of Wilkins and Lee, this is from Bill Bronston's book, instantly became a celebration for parents and concerned citizens in New York. The administration must make a move to protect itself and retake the initiative. Both Mike and Liz had been exemplary workers. They had brought about significant improvement in Building 6, a building packed with young adult men whose lot was wretched beyond belief. Next slide, please. This is Malachi McCourt getting escorted out of one of the buildings. And Dr. Jack Hammond is being interviewed constantly. The stress is rising. The parents stormed the administrative office in 1972, and they're being called communists and radicals and troublemakers, because remember, it's the early 70s. And still, throughout all of this that my mother's dealing with, she still managed to take me, a 9 and 10-year-old kid, to certain childhood events. Next slide, please. Here's a picture of my mother on the far left, next to Mike Wilkins. Malachi McCourt's in the middle. Connie Haney is next to Malachi. And there's me in one of these little things at like a church bazaar. My mom's beige Volkswagen Bug is in the back. And underneath that, I placed a little story I had written in 5th grade about a child who didn't have any parents and who was not loved. And it was this really sad story about this child who didn't have a family, basically. And I think that's directly related to having gone into Building 6 and listening and observing all of this that was taking place. Next slide, please. Television. I don't know why my mom was not on the Dick Cavett show, but you got to go back to the 1970s here. And men were, very much considered the experts that were still running the things. We've kind of, solved some of those things, not all, but some. And there was an effort for my mom and Mike Wilkins to get their jobs back, but they lost that fight. I do remember going up to Albany for a hearing with my mom and I believe Jane Kurtin, but I'm not sure. But there were a lot of people going up there. And next slide, please. So my mom said we were fired because we told the truth about the intolerable conditions at Willowbrook State School. And here are some more photographs. Next slide, please. The protests. I remember seeing the protests. There's Bernard Carabello up at the top. The photo down below is interesting here because it talks about Bergen-Belsen and Dachau. And you have to send your mind back to the early 1970s. World War II was not that far away in people's minds. So that concept of the concentration camp is indelible in us. And people were making that connection, but they couldn't make the connection before because they couldn't get into Willowbrook. But once that was penetrated, people were making the connection. And that is an ad for the TV documentary that definitely, I believe, went national. Next slide, please. Images from the TV documentary, the Willowbrook, The Last Great Disgrace. And there's a news article there, a little picture of Geraldo Rivera putting a microphone into Eleanor McGovern's face for a response. She took a tour. And back in those days, she was referred to as Mrs. George McGovern. I had to look up her name. It's Eleanor. But so that gives you the scope of how big this story went. Next slide, please. This is something I wanted you to read. If you can move your fingers a little bit on your screen. And this is from Geraldo Rivera. At one point during our filming, we came across a young boy being fed mush. His head was tilted back. We left Willowbrook and went to the Manhattan offices of Assemblyman Andrew Stein. He had called a noon press conference. He had to discuss the firing of Mrs. Lee and Dr. Wilkins and had asked them to attend. A group of parents was scheduled to meet us there also. Next slide, please. the New York Times, this was something I found in Dr. Bill Bronston's book, which was really interesting to me because basically it was the Staten Island Advance that brought this story to the public, and it was the Staten Island Advance that stayed with it. After the firings, after things were really blowing up, the New York Times had one article about it. And there are many reasons I think sometimes papers do that. They don't want to lose access. And that's discussed here. They didn't want to lose access to politicians. They didn't want to offend anyone. But clearly that's not the role of the paper. So it was not the New York Times that helped bring this story to the public. It was the Staten Island Advance. Again, it's the power of the local press. Next slide, please. This is a picture of the protesters out front. I remember seeing some of the protesters driving up. That sign says, "Remember Wilkins and Lee." And there are a lot of these images out there that are very interesting to me, that I was observing all of this. And obviously the kids at PS 30 were not having a life like this, but I was certainly in the midst of all of this protest and change. Next slide, please. Now, after my mom was fired, we moved into my grandparents' house. And this was sort of the second part to my childhood in a way. My grandmother was working, volunteering for the Occupational Training Center. My Uncle Brian was, he was there. He would learn there. He would do some work there. And she had been with the Staten Island Aid for Retarded Children, but now it was moving to Occupational Training Center. And it was a very loving household. And Brian would, I'd watch TV with him. And he liked matchbook cars, and he would roll his cars down the track into a laundry basket. Then he'd dump out the laundry basket on the other side, and he'd do the same thing back again. I'd play cars with him. He was on a bowling team, and they all had red shirts, and I found myself a red shirt, and I would go with my grandmother on the bowling trips. My grandparents hugged Brian a lot. And one of the funny stories is that when my grandparents were hugging in the hallway once, Brian walked up to them, put his arms around them. He was probably late teenager at this point, or in his 20s. And he said, "Aw," like making fun of them a little bit, and they loved it. So we always had these awe moments, and I would join in there too. So, I mean, hugs and love abounded in this house. Next slide, please. Okay, so January 3rd, 1973, this is about 3 days shy of the firing of Mike Wilkins and my mom. Jack Hammond died. Just 3 days shy of a year. And I remember my mom talking in my grandmother's house that when he died, she was saying that that was something they were afraid that was going to happen during all the protests and the turmoil and the doors being flung open and the parents streaming in, and Jack Hammond's complete inability to deal with any of this, that they were afraid that that might happen then. But it happened a year later. Next slide, please. My mom decides we are going to go to Mexico. So my guess is she probably wasn't too popular there, because now they're talking about basically we're moving towards closing Willowbrook State School and this concept of deinstitutionalization. And my mom's still living there. So she's made plans to go and get a master's degree at the University of Georgia. But before we go to Georgia, she decides to take a trip to Mexico. So we get into the Volkswagen Bug that the heat wouldn't go on if we went over 50 miles an hour. And we drive from New York in the winter, and we go all the way down to Texas, and we're staying in motels, and we cross the border in Texas, and it goes from 1973, it goes from pavement in Texas to a dirt road, like immediately. And then there's a cow crossing the road. And I said, "Mom, there's a cow crossing the road." And she said, "Yes, of course, we're in Mexico." And so for two people from New York City to sort of enter this country was very interesting, and it was never boring. We would drive past houses that were just built out of sticks, and I could see the people in the houses. And I said, Mom, they just seem so vulnerable in there. Who's going to help them? And I could only figure that they helped each other because they built the houses so that they could all see one another. And we would buy bags of sweetbreads for like less than a penny. And they were colored pink and green. And she read to me Robert Heinlein's The Red Planet in some of the hotels. And we went to a church that was one of these really old churches that the nuns lived in. And then they had these like instruments of self-flagellation that the nuns would kind of whip themselves and stuff. And that was all over the wall. And we walked out of that church, and my mom said, well, that was interesting, wasn't it? And I said, well, yeah, I've never seen anything like that. So next slide, please. After the trip to Mexico, we moved to Athens, Georgia. Now remember, Staten Island was redlined. I went to PS 30 in Westerly. Now I'm down in Athens, Georgia, and this is an integrated school. And I flew back and forth from Georgia to New York to see my dad, who was living with another police officer. So I stayed with my grandparents. So I stayed very close to my grandparents. But when I was in the school, I marveled at this school. The teacher was a woman who was Jewish from New York. And I watched her counsel a young boy who had put a Nazi swastika on his notebook. And then I would see girls with these cornrows, and I would just marvel at them thinking, how did their mothers do this? How does this work? How do you do a braid like that? And then all the girls had these little pieces of straw in their ears that were burned on the edges because they always had their moms pierce their ears. And I'd never seen anything like that. I would go up with my little tray to get my lunch, and these women, they were all Black women. And I thought, oh, they're not going to say anything to me. I just felt so shy and so small. And I had this really thick New York accent, and they were just so sweet and loving. And they would call me honey and sweetheart. And they would give me this food, and I'd take the food back to my table, and I had no idea what it was. It was collard greens and a lot of Southern food. And then I failed my first spelling test because I failed my first spelling test. I brought home the test, and it was a big F. And my mom said, how can you do this? Spelling is your best subject. I said, I can't understand a word they're saying because the accents were so thick. You got to send your mind back in time. They're probably not as thick right now. So the teacher would look at me after she said things that make sure I understood her. So like I said, I was flying back and forth. So I'm staying with my grandmother all summer as she's doing the work for Occupational Training Center. Next slide, please. We vacationed in the Catskills. Brian went everywhere, of course, and I went with them. And he would get in the bus, and they would take him to the Occupational Training Center, when we were back at home. And my grandfather was very close to Brian. He took him on long walks. He would walk through the golf course, and they'd collect golf balls. And they were just so tight and close. And my grandfather called him Blick. And I don't know where that came from. But at night, I would get up, and I could see my grandfather down the hall in the kitchen, and he'd be writing poetry at night by himself. It was just something he really did a lot. And he would read the poetry, and I could see him writing the poetry. One day at the shopping center, because they all went shopping together, Brian got lost. And when my grandparents came back with him, my grandmother was shaken. She said, oh, Brian got lost. It took him over an hour to find him, and he was just wandering around a store. And I said, oh my God, what'd you say to him? And she said, well, I said to him, you can't walk away from us because somebody might take you and I'd never see you again. And so I understood the gravity of the fear of raising a Down syndrome child and adult. Next slide, please. My grandmother made the paper a lot because she was a very active PTA person. She was president of the PTA, and she always referred. And remember, the nomenclature is mentally retarded. You go back in time. And she always referred to people with Down syndrome. She says, they're citizens, Jennifer. They're citizens. And that word is not as popular right now. We don't use it like we used to use it back in the 60s and the 70s. And I try to use it because citizens have the power in our country. The citizens do. So it's important. That word is important. And when I think back, what she was saying to me was, you can't take away citizens' rights. They have rights. Next slide, please. My grandmother was very religious, and she went to Holy Family Church, and there was a town hall down the street. This is in the 70s. This is around 76, maybe. And she went down there because she was fighting for group homes. And there must have been talk about a group home in the neighborhood. So there was a town hall, and the room was packed. And my grandmother sat there and she listened to everything. And when she came home, she said, I've never in my life heard people talk about people with Down syndrome in such terms. Just filthy, foul, and horrible to her. And the priest didn't say anything. He was weak. He didn't lead. And she wrote him a letter at a kitchen table and told him what he needed to do and what he didn't do and how she was not coming back to Holy Family Church. He must have been very upset because he called her to talk with her because he was about to lose a parishioner. And she told him exactly what she said in the letter. And I believe she told me she hung up on him, which is very interesting to me. She really stood her ground. And this is a lovely picture of Brian with the Christmas tree. Next slide, please. Grandmother gets in the paper again. Handicaps right and the community is stressed. Now, this is interesting to me when I found this article because the handicapped have a right to live where they desire. This is my grandmother's quote. The opponents of group homes have engaged in everything from sophisticated legal maneuvers to random acts of violence. Some things don't change. So here she was a member of the Staten Island Regional Retardation and Disabilities Council. Now, my grandmother walked into, or she was led into this life of activism. It was like each piece came through and she knew what to do. And she led. She was a leader. And I followed that lead and I listened to her and I listened very hard to everything she said. Next. My mom, at this point, she gets her master's in social work and we moved to Atlanta and we lived in a series of places, but the place that was the best was the Quaker House. So she had stopped working in social work at this point, but she had been working for the AFSC, and that's what introduced her to the Quaker Meeting House. And Dr. Mike Wilkins visited her there. And he tells me, he goes, do you remember when I came? And it's like, yeah, I sort of vaguely, and I'm sure I said hi and then, took off because I'm a teenager at this point. But this was a really wonderful place to live. And next slide, please. My family, the Cudahy family, and the Halls are very social family. We are way into the parties, and we just do singing. And there's Brian right there, lower left, and there's Brian in each of these pictures. So one of these is a vacation, one is a family picnic, and then one looks like perhaps a Christmas party. But he was always singing, he's always dancing, very loved. Next slide, please. My mother got a house on the Chattahoochee River, and my grandparents came down to visit. Now, my grandfather, you remember, is a poet. So the Chattahoochee River is in a famous poem by Sidney Lanier. And as they're driving to the cabin on the river, he starts to recite the poem, the song of the Chattahoochee. Out of the hills of Habersham, down the valleys of Hall, I hurry amain to reach the plain, run the rapid and leap the fall. Next slide, please. Those 3 medals in the photo on the left are the medals that my grandmother would pin to Brian's shirt. She doesn't go back to church, remember? So she's pinning. She always prayed at home. And sometimes I'd walk into the bedroom would be all dark, and I'd hear something and I'd realize, oh, she's praying. And so I'd sort of back out of the room. This is a lovely picture of my grandparents and Brian right on the banks of the Chattahoochee. In the early 1990s, my grandfather died shoveling snow or chipping the snow off the car. And my grandmother and my Aunt Patty had to tell Brian that he had died. And they went into the bedroom And Brian cried, of course, because he lost his dad, he lost his best friend. Next slide, please, because now it's my grandmother and Brian in 1995. Now, some people on this call can probably explain this a little bit more. My grandmother received the Hungerford Award. So the Hungerford, that it was a building that has to do with the OTC, and the Hungerford Award usually went to an educator. And I believe people were quite shocked when my grandmother received this. And she received it in 1995 for her undaunting spirit in providing parent leadership, advocacy, and personal time in helping establish, support, and promote programs and services that address the nature and needs of students with handicapping conditions at a most difficult transitional period in the development of the Occupational Training Center, now called the Richard H. Hungerford School. So there's the photo of Brian and my grandmother in Washington, D.C. on a vacation, and there's a shot of the award. Next slide, please. As I said, Willowbrook was a large employer, and if you look at my family, Willowbrook employed people in my family too, and I have a little list here. My aunt Edie, who was my mother's sister, my aunt Patty, my mother's sister, who actually also, she didn't work at Willowbrook, but special education teacher for New York Public Schools, did referrals for work placement. My mother, of course, my Uncle Tom, who stayed living at home with my grandmother and Brian, became a physician. My Aunt Helen worked in the kitchen of Willowbrook, and my father's father was a painter at Willowbrook. And when I grew up, I never had a total desire, not a total desire to give birth, but I always knew from a very young age I was going to adopt. And I made that decision at a very, like maybe 8 years old. And I think that has something to do with Willowbrook. But there's a picture of me and my daughter who I adopted. And then before I adopted her, she's in that little scrum there with all these other little babies in their carriers. And my mother explained to me after I brought my daughter home, she said, you know, you adopted your daughter from an orphanage, an institution. And I said, you know, I never really thought about that, but that is true. And my uncle had to find, because my grandmother was getting ill, and my Uncle Tom had to find a group home for Brian. So the group homes had been created, but my grandmother chose to keep Brian at home. So when she became ill, it was clear that Brian needed to have a group home. So he had to find one, and he had to go through many, I believe. You have to get on a waiting list. You have to go there. Does it fit? Does it not? He comes back, and you have to find one. Next slide, please. When my grandmother died in the early 2000s, it was 2005, I believe, I think. The obituary is quite intense. And I know that my aunts and my mom are looking through the clippings to see all the work that she had done. And I have a list here. So she was a charter member of the Staten Island Regional Mental Retardation and Disabilities Council. She served for 4 years as the president of the PTA of the former OTC. She was a member of the parents group of the former Staten Island Aid for Retarded Children. In 1981, she received a special recognition award from Borough President Gaeta, a citation of honor for her devotion to quality education from the Board of Education in 1974, then received the Hungerford Award. This lovely quote here. And I remember her telling me about this. Please don't shunt them aside. Help them to help themselves, she told the members of the City Planning Commission. The great thing about this obituary is that when my aunts and my mother were going through the clippings, they realized that the group home that my grandmother had fought for in the 70s was the one that my uncle inadvertently, coincidentally, had found for my Uncle Brian when he went to find a placement for him. So Brian actually went into the group home, quote unquote, that my grandmother had fought for, which is something that I actually think about quite a bit. Now, early in, and I know everybody's on chat, early on, I said there's something that my family does at a party, at a wedding, that there's never a wedding without one of these things. And I was wondering if in the chat you remembered what they were. And I can sort of see if you write it in there. It doesn't look like anybody's writing. One of two things always happens in the Cudahy family. One of two things. You don't remember. Oh my gosh. All right, I'll let you know. It's either sheet cakes or conga lines. Next slide, please. And this is Brian with one of the people who work in the group home that he was in. As you can see, he's on a conga line. He loved them. And so this is one of the last slides. And this is basically the story. So I thought I would end it with the last stanza from the Song of the Chattahoochee, because at this point I'm on the PUSD school board, and I believe very strongly in inclusive practices. And I believe that we need to fully fund IDEA, which I lobby for as a trustee. So the last stanza of the Song of the Chattahoochee: downward the voices of duty call, downward to toil and be mixed with the main. The dry fields burn and the mills are to turn, and a myriad flowers mortally yearn. And the lordly main from beyond the plain calls over the hills of Habersham, calls through the valleys of Hall. Thank you. Next slide. That's my grandmother and Brian. There's also credits on the last slide of this that shows you everywhere where I received the photographs, the books, and obviously family memories and family photos. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jennifer.
Sure.
That was really great. So we're running a little behind, so I'm not going to ask you too many questions. I want to give a chance to the people in the audience, but I actually would like to ask if Elizabeth Lee and Michael Wilkins have any particular questions that they'd like to ask you, or anything like they'd like to add to what you just presented.
Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
Yeah, Mike Wilkins. Jennifer, that's so excellent. It just touched me. But then toward the end, I realized the best thing about it is it starts out sad and it ends up with, people's, how wonderful people are in fighting for people that can't fight for themselves. And congratulations. That's just so educational and so interesting. And your grandma must have been an amazing person. I mean, she fought and fought and fought, and it was a hard battle in those days. There were no services, and she created some. It was so good. So I thank you. I don't think I have a question, except where have I been all these months when I wanted to see that, but you do it in California. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks.
I'd like to say something.
Yes, please.
This is the first time I've seen the whole presentation, and I was feeling just a little guilty on that section where I took her into Building 6. But it brought back memories of why I did it. And so many of us at the institution were trying to get help from outside. We were trying to tell this story. And I was afraid that the help wouldn't come at that point. And I associated Willowbrook and other institutions that are total institutions with World War II and with concentration camps, because I felt like that was the direction in which things were heading. And I had thought that a child should know, because as things continued, this would become their world and they would have to carry on.
Well, I don't think you should feel guilty about it. It was a really important event, and it only took, I was only in there for like 15 minutes, but you know, I definitely remember that, and I remember it being like the zoo.
Yeah.
So, I have a question. Catherine, can I ask a question?
Please, go ahead.
Yeah, so, this is for Elizabeth. So there was a social worker who came after you and who went and got her master's degree in Colorado. What was that story, Mom?
And she was hired after I was fired. I still had, I never had a key like my, but I had access, and I decided at one point that what I really wanted to do was to go back into the baby buildings where I had started a parents group and continue that. And the administration let me, you know, I didn't ask them, and, and they didn't stop me. And it was good. At that same time, the all of the publicity and caused Willowbrook, of course, to have to start hiring. And they were hiring people from around the country. And the woman who was hired to take my position was multi-handicapped. She was blind, and she had other disabilities, and she had striven her entire life to reach what she wanted to do in life, to have options. And at every turn, doors had been closed on her, but she'd managed to find a way to open them. And at one point, she had gone out to Colorado to go get a degree, and the dean of the school there found out after the fact how disabled she was, and tried to keep her from even getting off the plane. And part of, I guess, in some respects, too, we were somewhat naive. Now, the people in the social work department were wonderful. They were always trying to do something to make changes. And when she applied at Willowbrook, they wanted to hire her. And I thought it was a good idea, too. And what we didn't know was how traumatizing that could also be, and that there were no supports. And shortly after several months of working there, she did commit suicide. And I've often thought about that. And it's that she had worked so hard, and yet the world that should have been open to her wasn't. And I think I'm feeling sometimes now like that this is a space that we're coming back into, because we're at a point where people are talking openly about bringing back institutions for some people. And I feel very strongly that that's something we can't allow to happen. She too had been raised at home, and her parents had done everything they could for her. But ultimately, what they couldn't do was change that public opinion. And she identified so strongly when she got into the baby buildings with the children there, that I think she felt a sense of hopelessness. And I think we're now at the point of opportunity where it's going to take many people really reaching out and saying, you know, we're a society, and everybody is a member of our society, and we must have these options for everybody.
Elizabeth, I think you raise a really central issue that often is not talked about in the Willowbrook story, and it's that a total institution is also total for the people who work for the institution.
Yes.
And that the trauma for the people who work in it, either, you know, many clearly sort of go blank and just do the work, and then others feel compelled to try to change it, often at great cost to themselves. And I think you and Mike are both examples of people who were willing to take on that risk and that cost. But could you maybe both speak a bit about that? What was that compelled you, that gave you that strong sense of being willing to face, because I know you were being threatened with being fired long before you were actually fired, yes?
Oh, yes. But, Dr. Hammond, I unfortunately raised his ire shortly after I got there by trying to arrange to place but Willowbrook had its own foster care program. And one of my tasks was to find children to put into foster care. And I had spoken with one parent about her child who was about age 3. And I was a little clumsy about it. I did not realize fully that when somebody had placed their child in Willowbrook, because other people told them that was their only alternative, and that then you as a social worker come along and say, well, you know, your child could live in foster care and her situation would be much better, that it arouses strong feelings. And the parent called Jack Hammond, and he sent word back that maybe I shouldn't be allowed to do anything. But what sort of what affected me in terms of Willowbrook was when I was 15 years old. I had an English class at Port Richmond High School, and I read a popular novel of that day, which was sort of heavy hitting, but it was still written as a popular novel by John Hershey, which was The Warsaw Ghetto. And it affected me so much that for about 2 weeks, I couldn't think about anything else. And the fact, it brought me back to this sense of sometimes little children have when they try to figure out what's outside the universe. You know, we're here, we can't get out. and the Warsaw Ghetto, that's what affected me, was things had happened that left people with no options. They were going to die. And that when I walked into Willowbrook on my first day there, that's what came into my mind.
And Mike, what about you?
Well, yeah, I went into Willowbrook. I was very active in the let me see, name of the organization. I'm trying to think of it. It was about the human rights in the medical field, Medical Committee for Human Rights. And I went to all the meetings and they would do a lot of excellent things. And I also happen to just have an interest in asylums. I had read the book Asylums. I can't remember the name of the sociologist who wrote it, but he also wrote a book called The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life. So 2 great books. I had read a series in the New Yorker about the fact that in New York State, they had deinstitutionalized the institutions for mentally ill people after the development of phenothiazines for the condition of schizophrenia, so people could live in the community. And so I was shocked when during my pediatric rotation and my internship in New York City, my pediatric chief took me. Yeah, Irving Goffman is the name of the writer. Thank you. We toured Willowbrook, and it was so classical, and for an institution, is instantly recognizable because such places had been photographed by a lot of excellent photographers who happen to be good at finding unacceptable places to photograph. Okay, so I felt prepared. I knew I wanted to go there then, and I didn't have any idea about ever the place closing down, but I wanted to experience it and see what it was like. And try to help make it better. And so when I got there, though, I realize now that I'm a rather fragile fellow, and it wasn't good for me to be there. And so I spent a lot of years reckoning with all of those experiences, and I didn't, in those days, we didn't know what trauma was. And I want to talk about the trauma of all the employees, not just me. I mean, a lot of us don't acknowledge our trauma while it's occurring. But I was hit after I left. I flew away from New York City. If I would be in New York and I would see people surging up from a subway to the sidewalk, it would trigger me, because when I would enter the locked day room at Willowbrook, the people would swarm me, any friendly face. And it was just so it was like, it made me question whether there was a loving God in that place. It really did. And so after 6 months of hanging around New York, after getting fired, I came back home to my hometown of Kansas City, and I finished my internal medicine residency, and I got married to a wonderful woman, and we had 5 kids. And I never would go back to the grounds of Willowbrook, not with those kids. After it was a college, I did take them joyfully, and I was proud. And the building 6 still had the number 6 on it, and I got a photograph of us under that number 6. But that's about as far as I would take it, with my kids. And so, yeah, I mean, I had a case of post-traumatic stress syndrome, which that disease wasn't even characterized until the 80s, or after the Vietnam War veterans came back. So that was how it affected me. I'm not proud of having been so weak, but I was saying to myself, why can't I just fight that fight? I'm running away from this place. I was full of visions and sounds, and that's all in retro. I thought it was me. I had a brother that had been in Korea as a sharpshooter for the Marine Corps, and he came back from the Marine Corps similar, and I knew that. I said, what's wrong with us? Yeah, that's the legacy that it left me with. And just seeing Jennifer's presentation, I must say, these visions trigger me. I actually physically want to vomit. So I'm sorry to say, but I want to say for everybody that might have those feelings, it's okay to verbalize them, because if you don't, you're ashamed of them. I'm not exactly ashamed. I understand it, and understanding and being able to give it a name is very meaningful. I'll quit talking. But
thank you so much for sharing that. I think it's really important for people to hear. Sorry, Elizabeth, go ahead.
It's interesting because in the 70s in Atlanta, I worked with, while I was at the American Friends Service Committee, an organization called Southern Center for Military and Veterans Rights. And what we did was Jimmy Carter had started a program for returning vets from Vietnam, many of whom had less than honorable discharges and couldn't even get jobs. And there was a program, for upgrading that. And I think there's a psychologist in Atlanta who did begin that diagnosis, I guess, of post-traumatic stress disorder. And it was very real among the soldiers returning from Vietnam.
And I want to share that David Good put in the Q&A, spoken so beautifully, and for so many people who worked in such places. Me too. So you're not alone at all, Mike. Not alone, Elizabeth. I mean, I've heard so many stories from people who worked there. And part of the difficulty for them in the memorialization of Willowbrook is that sometimes the public understanding, as we talk about the negative conditions, get attributed to something about the people who were working there rather than massive underfunding, overcrowding, those things, and the desperate attempts on the part of people working there to try to provide something like a human environment and the impossibility for many to be able to do that. So I think it's very important that we do talk about that too. So I
Well,
think
the humanity that many of the residents of Willowbrook were able to experience was because of people like the ward attendants
yes.
who brought that human feeling with them. And one of the ironies that I've been thinking about is a ward attendant probably did not have in their job description, you have to hold a baby for at least 15 minutes a day.
Yeah.
But yet they would. They would try to do that. They would try to give that gift of touch just to keep children alive.
Yes. So there are a couple of things that people have said I just want to share. One for Elizabeth from Marlene Dunham. My brother is alive and well and happy in a New York State group home at age 69. He did make it out. So thank you very much for being part of that story. Also, I'm just trying to, Peggy Cudahy is here. Jennifer, we would love to be able to get in touch.
She did so much volunteer work. And then she became a special education teacher.
Mm-hmm. So may I share your email address with her?
Oh, definitely.
Okay, great. And then we do have a few questions I'd like to bring forward. And one is a kind of common theme is why do you think this went on for so long? Even after the conditions were public, it took a while and it was still a fight after that. Why do you think people, first of all, were willfully kind of not paying attention when many people did know what was going on? And then even after it came out, resisted acknowledging it. What do you think that was about? I mean, I think Jennifer talked a bit about the reluctance of the New York Times to cover it, to jeopardize their own political contacts. But
I think that was partly because when Mike had asked me, we were at a down period when he called Geraldo, because I think Gerry Rivera had done some legal work for him before that. And I said, yeah, that seems like a good idea. Afterwards, I thought maybe it would have been better, actually, if we had involved the parents in the parents group in making that decision, because it would have further strengthened the parents group, and they would have agreed. But I think that's why the New York Times, and this is in any kind of movement, the New York Times didn't have an entree the way Geraldo did. He had an exclusive. And so the New York Times had a hard time getting its angle in. And they're a conservative newspaper. I had had dealings with them before that on totally separate issues. And they're very much aligned to dealing with senators and the people in power. And so to the New York Times, we were two fired aides. and same with some other people who were one thing that's very human, and I wasn't always aware of, but sometimes I had to remind myself of, was that so many people had been told to put their family member in institutions that you never knew when you were dealing with the New York Times, who among people who worked there had been in that position. And there's a natural tendency to feel defensive. And I found that frequently among people who are better educated, that they were more likely to do these placements. And because the specter, the stigma of mental retardation often hits people who are well educated much harder. And that came home to me when I was, I also worked for the CDC a little bit. I did a project for the CDC there, where a strain of dysentery had come into the institution and nobody knew where it came from. There was dysentery there, but this was a new strain. And the researcher asked me to track it down. The head of the baby buildings had suggested that I do that. And what I found, and Ira Fisher came with me when we found some likely suspects. And it was a little girl who was 3 years old. She was from Puerto Rico, and she had come to New York to live with her aunt. And her aunt had been told, because we went to interview her, and she told us through a family interpreter the story. Her aunt had been told that this was a school, and this is the right place for your child, for your niece. And what happened was that she took her there, and then she went to visit, and she took her right out. And she had brought in the strain from Puerto Rico. And I always remember what she said to me. What she said to us was, it wasn't a school. And she knew, even though she was an uneducated person, and so many educated people did not make that connection, you know. So I think that is still an issue in our society. And the other, of course, is that people simply feared the unknown and the different, and you become the other. And the third is that once you start an institution, it becomes, and sometimes they're even planned as an economic benefit for a community. And as Jennifer put in the presentation, this was the second largest employer on Staten Island.
True. You want to add to that, Mike?
Well, the question, I think, was why did it go on so long? The institution, that idea to institutionalize people, is that?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, it started with Jeremy Bentham. I think he was a 18th century philosopher and who came up with his idea of this perfect place where you could keep people in their own rooms. But basically, again, it does kind of, a lot of these issues come back to human rights, the concept. And where did these come from? They come from us people. Each civilization has to decide what their values are. And luckily, some of us believe that human rights are the place to start, the value to start, and it results in democracy and a lot of other good ideas of kindness and development of human potential. But institutions are the opposite of that, and it has to do with dehumanization of people that are different from you, and segregation of them. And so this is just another example of that. I think institutions, but these are the most vulnerable people. Obviously, I don't have to tell our listeners that, but that's what I think. I think those kids were, and I call them kids. I had a building with kids, were dehumanized, and the doctors didn't think they felt pain and stuff like that. So yeah, I think that it was easy in certain decades and periods of time in history to make those assumptions about people that couldn't. And then it just followed, actually, the theory of evolution, and brought about all these ideas about superiority as strength, and we have defectives and stuff like that. But nowadays, this concept of love and our strength as human beings
Mhm.
is empathy rather than judgment and segregation. It's all of a piece. Thanks.
Yes, definitely. And I'd want to make the connection to, I mean, it is depressing when you realize that these things there are still negative attitudes out there and people who are resisting full integration. And David Good mentions that as somebody who's written a book about Willowbrook State School, to know that how long, Elizabeth says Willowbrook is dead, long live Willowbrook, right? How long that goes on is a bit depressing. But then I'm thinking about the IDEA, the support that you've been giving to that, Jennifer. And I mean, to me, that's sort of the next evolutionary step, right? You want to say something about that?
I do, because our superintendent, Dr. Elizabeth Blanco, when I first became a trustee, we were just talking, and her background was in special education. And I said, just sort of offhand, oh, my mom was one of the whistleblowers of Willowbrook who got fired. And she stopped. She goes, your mom was one? And I said, oh, yeah. And she
Superhero.
goes, I studied this when I was in school, getting my dissertation, getting her doctorate. And so we started talking a lot. And she started saying to me that inclusive practices is where we want to go, that all the studies show that all children do better when they're all together. And I've been to some conferences now where a lot of people will say, it's really just disheartening to be in a class and teaching, and a teacher comes in and takes out a few kids, and then they come back in. That's that concept of special education and separating, that we want to go into inclusive practices. So after I did this the first time, Dr. Blanco came up to me and said, you got to do this all over the state. I said, really, why? She goes, because we need money for inclusive practices and we need IDEA fully funded. So that's what I've been doing. And, so the IDEA, they were going to, when it was passed in 75, they were going to pay 40% of all special education costs. They've never done, Congress has never done that. But it's even goes beyond that. It goes to really reconceptualizing public education and how we see ourselves as human beings in public education. So that's what's happening in the Pasadena Unified School District right now, as far as what we're planning and what we're talking about and how we're moving ahead on this. And yes, she says this is the next part. Dr. Blanco says this is the next part to what, the work that was done with Willowbrook, where we're going now. She goes, this is where people are going. So it's very interesting to me.
Right. Well, and also I want to share, David McClanahan has said, I think an important part of the story is how after many Willowbrook residents were released, they assumed important roles in the fight themselves, such as Bernard Carabello, that voice, that the fight in their own voice for their own rights was a very important part of this story too.
That's always the strongest voice.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. And it reminds me of your grandmother saying, you need to remember that these are citizens. They're citizens, Jennifer.
Yes.
And they're citizens. They are citizens. I mean, we need that on banners everywhere. So there are many things that have come in the Q&A that I want to share, that are comments from people in the Q&A that I just want to share with you. Diane Buglioli says, thank you for sincerely laying the path for those who followed that righteous path. She's a former employee at Willowbrook, also a member of our Willowbrook Legacy Project Committee. Susan Elam says, my Nana worked there. She used to come home with these terrible stories, and one day she was allowed to bring home a young lady to have dinner with us. My mom worked with the babies for the summer. There's so many. Every time I mention anything about Willowbrook on Staten Island, and I'm not originally from Staten Island, people all say, oh, I have this member of my family who worked there, or I have somebody who was there as a resident. Over and over again, it's such a family story in Staten Island. Allison Bardsley shares, I'm so inspired by the compassion and also the organizing wisdom shown by you all. I hope to hold on to this feeling. So there's many thanks. Oh, and then Marlene Dunham asks, what does the IDEA stand for? It's
Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act.
That's right. So it's an education version in a way of the ADA, right? It extends all of those.
And
so Diane, go ahead. Diane Buglioli has raised her hand a couple of times. I'm going to promote her to speak if that's
okay. Hi.
Hi, Diane.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Mike. How are you? It's been a long time no see. I want to thank the two of you. In 1969, I was 19, and I heard about you rebels while I was working there. And very proud to know Mike, and really thrilled to be able to see you here tonight, Elizabeth. And I also know a lot about Lillian Hall because of her work on the council. But I just wanted to say one thing that I always do in my presentation, and it's this. Willowbrook, it's not just the buildings. Willowbrook to me is a concept. So anytime a person with a disability is not seen, that's Willowbrook to me. We can close down the buildings and all of that. And you folks that started that and did that. But today, what we need to be mindful as activists is any time it has nothing to do with a building or the size of a building. It has to do with the concept and how people are treated and whether they're seen as being visible and as your grandmother said, as citizens. So I just wanted to say that out loud. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Diane.
Thank you.
David Good also shares that sadly, the persistence of institutions of various sizes is because of big business, a huge industry of keeping people dependent. And he's recommending a book from 2022 called Health Communism by Beatrice Adler Bolton and Artie Vierkant that looks at that more fully. Also, another one of our members of our committee says, "Hi, this is Eric Goldberg. Thanks for the great presentation to all the presenters. I have a brother who is disabled, and me included. We need more people. We need more people to support this kind of work." Okay. So we're a bit over time, but I think it's okay. I don't mind. I hope you don't mind being over. I hope the audience doesn't mind, but nobody's leaving. So I don't think anybody really minds. They'd be out the door, I guess. So one thing also, I mean, there's a couple more questions, but one thing that also really sticks out to me is the feeling that's clearly about family, right? That there's a kind of family sense between people who worked there and the people that were there. And I think, I don't want to put Michael on the spot, but I do feel like the relationship that you have after he left Willowbrook with Bernard Carabello, to me, is very meaningful and very moving. A kind of brothers relationship, brothers in arms kind of feeling between the two of you that's lovely to see. And, I'm wondering about, Elizabeth, that your family connection did influence the way that you must have been in the institution, having a brother with Down syndrome.
Oh, definitely, yes.
Right? That must have shaped the way that you looked at the people that were there.
Right, because I could see my brother developing as a person
And he learned to
who
write.
had all the rights of a person,
Right.
that would have a family, that, you could get help with what you needed. You weren't alone. And so I, in a sense, had that benefit when I walked in to see that stark difference. And I often saw people who worked in the institution trying to bring that sense of family, but it was almost impossible for them because, of the conditions and they were so overworked. But if people aren't in the community and doing all of these things, as the other speaker said there, that if you're not visible, that's a huge problem. That leads the entree to the institution.
Right. That they're just, products to be moved around, just objects and not.
Yes. And in fact, and some of the comments I've seen and people reacting to Governor Newsom's plan with the homeless people in California, which many people fear will result in bringing back institutions. I see people making those comments and saying, and think of all the jobs that will be created. And that's exactly what we don't want.
Right. I mean, there's David Good's story about it being a for-profit industry. It's very problematic.
And it makes perfect sense if you think of people mainly in economic terms instead of in terms of being part of a society. And I think over the last several decades, unfortunately, we have been moving towards a society that puts economics first, as though we're economic units. And in fact, if you remember during the pandemic, there was a politician in Texas who was opposed to shutting things down to save people's lives, and especially elderly people. And he said any grandparent should be happy to die for this strong economy for their grandchildren. And that sort of epitomized it. is that we more and more keep thinking and trying to put people in economic terms, trying to take liberal arts out of colleges, like West Virginia has just made a decision in one college there that they're going to get rid of their liberal arts program because it doesn't lead to jobs. And that's exactly the wrong point of view as far as I can see.
Yeah.
Definitely. Well, when we were about to, just before we opened the Willowbrook Mile in 2022, that was the year of Willowbrook, just before that, Mayor Adams of New York made a statement after there was a horrible incident of a person with mental illness pushing a woman in front of a subway train and killing her, that maybe we made a mistake closing Willowbrook, making it very clear that he didn't understand that Willowbrook was not an institution for the mentally ill, but instead for people with IDD, et cetera.
Yes.
But so that was such a motivator for us to have the desire to make sure people understood what Willowbrook actually meant, and that we were never wanting to go back to those total institutions. That was not the answer to this problem. But it was quite chilling to hear that stated. And there was a big outcry from the community of advocates, but also from much of Staten Island, because I think people in Staten Island do have a better understanding of what Willowbrook actually represented and don't want to go back to it. Yeah. But you're right.
That's a strength. That's something to build on, definitely.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think probably it's about 40 minutes after we were supposed to end, so probably we should come to an end. There are many people asking a few things or asking to share with you how much they appreciate hearing you tonight and how important it's been over the years, all of the work that's come out of that brave act of yours to bring this out into the public eye. And, I hope that there are social work students here and medical for future doctors here who will be able to understand what it meant for you to make these choices, to make these decisions, to take these chances, even to make the sacrifices that you made, that those things were, I mean, they must be turning points in your lives, that there may be a kind of way that there was a life before and after that moment, that defined many of the things.
That's very true.
Yeah. So we really do.
Yeah.
I do appreciate your historical role, but more than that, I appreciate you still being here and still fighting the good fight in the ways that you are. So thank you so much. And thank you, Jennifer, for carrying on that legacy of your grandmother and the group homes and your mother. It's great for me as a women's historian to see the women's story of this brave, nurturing advocacy on the part of women that's often not acknowledged as it should be.
True. Catherine, can I ask my mom just to add one little story before you go?
Please. Yes.
So, Mom, will you tell them about teaching some people to drive at Willowbrook?
Well, at Willowbrook, when you went in as a social worker, it was very unlike Bureau of Child Welfare, where there were systems of checks and balances, and you had a very defined job, and supervisors looked over your work and made sure everything was being done for the children in question. And that was the Bureau of Child Welfare in New York City. In Willowbrook, it was sort of, well, you can do something. There were only about 10 of us, and there were thousands of people in the institution, so you got to pick and choose. And there were 2 boys in Building 6 who were legally blind. And I had been struck in dealing with them of how they didn't experience everyday life and what it meant to just have a daily routine in a home. And they liked my car, which was an old Volkswagen Beetle. It wasn't old, but it was a Volkswagen Beetle of the day. And I used to take them to drive around the grounds on Willowbrook, and I let them drive. And it was safe because the grounds were very big in there. And so we went down like ordinary road and other little roads like that on the grounds. And they loved it. It was absolutely to feel, a steering wheel and to get some of that sense of power over a car. And it was great. And in later years, I read about somebody who had done something similar in the South, and I could really connect.
That's great. They were probably safer inside of your Volkswagen than they might have been just walking around, to be honest.
True.
That's wonderful. That's great. Thank you so much. Okay, I'm going to welcome back Nora.
All right, I think that's a perfect way to end this event tonight. Thank you so much for coming. We really enjoyed your stories, and it was so nice to meet you, Elizabeth and Jennifer. And of course, Mike, always great to have you. And I just want to help everyone who helped put this event together and ask everyone to follow us on Eventbrite so you can be notified of upcoming events. And we hope to see you next year. Have a good night.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you all so much.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you so much. Are you trapped, Elizabeth? I'm gonna end the meeting. Don't worry.
Bye. Take care. Good night.
Nora, do you
Bye.
know if it saves the Q&A back and
It-
forth?
It does.
Okay, good.
But
All right,
should
I
I
want-
just grab it?
Yeah, could you? I just want to make
Yeah,
sure
let
that
me just grab it.
all of the,
There's a way to download.
okay. Here, I'll answer, I'll do
Because
all,
it's usually come as a file.
they'll all be in answered.
Mhm. Oh, that's why it's on my other screen.
Okay. Everything should be in answered now.
Okay.
I'll come back. Thank you.
Right. You are welcome.
I'm so glad we finally.
Great event. This
That
was
down.
fantastic. Okay, I got it all.
Okay. Thank you
All
so
right.
much, Nora.
Take care. Good night.
We'll talk tomorrow.
Yep. Yep, absolutely.
Thank
Bye.
Thank you. Thank
Bye.
you, Liz. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.